Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Sea Battles series. This story is titled The Constitution and the Guerriere. After declaring war on England in 1812, the United States sent a fleet of 6 men of war to cruise south from Boston to look for the British Jamaica Squadron. They found nothing but a small fleet of British merchant ships, a captured American ship, and a 36-gun British ship, the Belvidera. The Belvidera managed to escape the Americas and headed for Halifax with the news that America had declared war on England. Halifax was the largest British naval base in America. The longer the Americans could keep news of the war from reaching Halifax, the better off they were. But the Belvidera reached the port safely, and Halifax was alerted. 5 large warships were immediately sent out to look for Commodore Rogers of the United States Navy. It was the intention of the squadron to chastise the Americans for their attempt to dispute British mastery of the seas. The squadron started by raiding United States merchant ships in the New York harbor. It captured the big Nautilus, the first warship to be captured in the war, and when the United States frigate Constitution appeared off the harbor, the 5 British ships trained their guns on her. The Constitution had taken on a fresh crew at Annapolis and was sailing north to New York. Isaac Hull, captain of the frigate, spotted the ships, but he couldn't determine their nationality. He signaled the British ships to identify themselves, but they didn't answer. Then night fell, and they were blotted from view. When day broke, Hull found himself surrounded by British frigates. Not only were there the original 5 British men of war which had left Halifax, but there was the captured Nautilus which had been pressed into British service. Captain Hull knew that the best he could do was to escape. He took advantage of the wind and disappeared. The British started to chase him. The wind held through the second day, but then it died and the Constitution was becalmed for several hours. It was then that Captain Hull saw a storm approaching. Clouds began to appear, promising a squall of uncertain proportions, while in a short time sheets of gray, which the experienced sea dog knows to be rain, were driving toward them. With great ostentation, the Constitution was made ready to resist a severe gale. The enemy could see the nimble American jackies taking in sail and furling the lighter canvas. They could also see the clouds and rain. There was no doubt about it, a bad squall was coming. So the British prepared for a bad storm. Reefs were taken in the larger sails, some of which were even close furled. Knowing the peril of being caught in a storm too close together, the British warships separated. Each captain was ordered to meet the storm as best he could. Before these preparations had been completed, the rain reached the Constitution, and she was engulfed in a heavy shower which hid her from view of the enemy. The British didn't know that, in the midst of the deluge of rain, the American jackies were taking up the reefs they had run a short time before and shaking out the sail to almost full speed. Then, with the uprising wind filling her canvas, the Constitution sprang forward and headed for Boston Harbor. After traveling through the storm for over an hour, they passed through it. But the wind still held good, and their ship continued to drive well. The British by now were so far behind that they were practically out of the chase. 2 of them were actually hull down, while one was a mere speck against the horizon line. Blanketed by the storm, they had not seen their fugitive getting away, and had made no effort to throw their furled sail until the squall had passed. Then they started to chase her again. Instead of gaining on the Constitution, which was really a faster ship, the British ships fell further and further behind. Finally, they had all disappeared from view, and the American frigate continued on her way to Boston. An unexpected meeting. You say her name is Guerriere? Yes, I have just recently been commissioned to her. She carries 38 guns and is as fast as a hound. A fine craft, Hull. Mayhap she is, Decres, but you may just watch out for that ship of yours if I ever catch her in the Constitution. Both speakers were dressed in the uniform of naval officers. One, the taller, wore the British insignia of a captain. The other, the markings of an American captain. The Englishman now laughed good-naturedly. "If war comes, Hull, I hope you may be spared the irony of fighting one another. But if we do, I will bet £100 sterling that your Constitution will strike her colors to my Guerriere. What do you say?" "No," said Hull. "I'll bet no money on it, and could not use your English sterling anyhow. However, I will stake you a hat on the outcome in favor of the Constitution." "Done," responded Dacres promptly. This little banter took place at a social gathering in Philadelphia, while the ships of the two officers were lying in the Delaware. Although even then the cloud of war hung threateningly over the edge of the horizon, Captain Hull, American, and Captain Dacres, Englishman, were still good friends. Dacres and Hull did meet each other as enemies. Hull was in charge of the Constitution when it escaped from the British squadron in the New York harbor. Dacres captained one of the ships that chased him. After her escape from the British fleet, the Constitution remained at Boston only a few days and then cruised along the New England coast. She captured 2 small English merchantmen at a point off Cape Sable and forced an English sloop of war to release an American brig. Shortly afterward, Captain Hull met a Salem privateer and learned that a British frigate was cruising in the neighborhood. He set out to find the frigate, not dreaming that it was the Guerriere, the ship his friend Captain Dacres, that he was looking for. It was not long before the search was ended. One morning there came a long-drawn hail of "Sail ho!" from the lookout aloft. The Constitution was at once headed toward the stranger, who was not yet visible from the deck. In half an hour she was made out to be a frigate. She altered her own course and bore down the American ship. She was either a friend or a very audacious enemy. Without waiting longer, Captain Hull began operations for action. The topgallant sails were furled and the lighter spars lowered to the deck. The decks were cleared and the guns uncovered. Through their glasses, the officers could see the stranger making similar preparations. Still, it was uncertain that she was an enemy. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the two ships were rapidly nearing, but were still too far off to identify each other accurately. The drums of the American frigate beat to quarters. The crew took battle stations. The Guerriere also prepared for battle. Although Captain Dacres had been unable to establish the identity of the other vessel, he was too good a commander to take it for granted that she was a friend. He called Captain William Orney, an American sailor whom he had taken prisoner some days before. Handing the American his glass, Captain Dacres asked, "Captain Orney, what do you think of that vessel? Is she friend or foe to me?" Taking the spyglass, Orney inspected the distant frigate carefully. He saw by her peculiar sails and general appearance that she was without doubt an American vessel, and he answered candidly, "I think, sir, from her behavior, that she is an American frigate, but I do not recognize her." "He has a familiar look to me somehow," said Dacres, puzzled. "I can hardly credit him with being an American, however, for he comes down too boldly for such." "It is by his very boldness that I make certain he is an American," retorted the prisoner. The British officer laughed. "So be it, sir," he said. "The better he behaves, the more credit we shall gain by taking him." As the two ships came down toward each other, the Guerriere backed her main topsail and waited for her opponent to draw near enough to open fire. Dacres set the English flag at each masthead and beat to quarters. When the frigate came to within 2 or 3 miles, she took in all her light sails, reefed her topsails, and made final preparations for battle. Then she filled away and ran down to meet the Guerriere. Captain Dacres again turned to his American prisoner. "Captain Orney," he said politely, "as I suppose you do not wish to fight against your own countrymen, you are at liberty to retire below the water line." The American officer bowed and started for the cockpit. With him went half a dozen American seamen whom Dacres had impressed into his crew and whom he now chivalrously relieved from duty. Captain Dacres saw the stars and stripes go up on the masthead of the frigate. He fired, but his shot fell short. So he turned the Guerriere around and shot from her port. He hit the rigging and the hull. The Constitution answered with 2 shots, and the Guerriere fired another broadside. For an hour, the Guerriere fired heavily at long range. The American ship took only an occasional shot at the Guerriere. As this ineffectual firing continued, the 2 ships were slowly drawing nearer and nearer, and the gunners on the Constitution became so restless that they could hardly keep still. Captain Hull was pacing the quarterdeck with short, quick steps, trying to keep cool. Lieutenant Morris, the second in command, came up and asked his permission to let him respond with a broadside, saying that the gunners were becoming almost unruly in their impatience to do more firing. But Hull shook his head. A few minutes later, the request was repeated. This time, there was no response at all. Captain Hull was too busy watching the enemy to hear or see his junior officer. When a little later the ships were within half a pistol shot of each other, Hull gave his orders. "Now, boys, pour it into them," he shouted, at the top of his lungs, gesturing so violently that the tight breeches of his naval uniform split far down the side. Lieutenant Morris repeated his superior's orders. "Hull her, lads, hull her," he cried. The guns had already been carefully aimed. Now, with slow match, they were touched off. The effect of the first broadside was terrific. Captain Orney, deep in the cockpit of the Guerriere, said afterward that he heard a tremendous explosion from the opposing frigate. The effect of her shot seemed to make the Guerriere reel and tremble as though she had received the shock of an earthquake. Immediately after this, I heard a tremendous shock on deck, and was told that the mizzenmast was shot away. In a few moments, the cockpit where I was filled with wounded men. I did not like to see them suffer, but I was overjoyed that the American was getting in such good work. But in the seclusion of the cockpit, this American prisoner could not see the gunners on the 2 ships, their bare breasts covered with stains of powder and rivulets of blood and sweat, pulling fiercely at the gun tackle and wielding rammers with frantic energy. He could not see the British ship's mizzenmast go crashing and hurtling from its ragged stump into the sea, carrying with it some of the top men and throwing others far out into the churning waters, choked with freshly made debris. He could not see the great ragged breach torn in the Guerriere's quarter by the falling mast. The Constitution drew slowly ahead, pouring in more broadsides. Then she left until she lay right across the enemy's bow. This brought the bowsprit of the Guerriere across the quarterdeck of the American, where it was soon fouled in the mizzen rigging of the Constitution. Then both ships sounded the bugle call for the boarders. The hand-to-hand fighting crews lined up on both decks. They wore boarding caps on their heads and carried a cutlass in one hand and a cocked pistol in the other. But the sea was heavy and the 2 ships were tossing so violently that it was impossible to board the enemy's ship. The Dacres and Hull called their men back to their heavy guns, but the 2 ships were close enough now that pistols could be used effectively. Both crews fired with everything they had. The big guns now could touch the side of the enemy ship. Men were killed and wounded in terrifying numbers. Even Dacres had been hit. The 2 ships were being torn to pieces. The Constitution caught fire. A flash from the British guns started the blaze in one of the cabins, and smoke billowed out of her decks of both ships. But the Americans managed to stamp out the fire which threatened to destroy both ships. Lieutenant Morris tried to lash the 2 ships together single-handedly, but he failed. Then he called to his men to try to board the Guerriere. As they poised on the rail, a British volley caught them. Then the heavy ocean pulled the 2 ships apart. The tangled riggings tore free from one another. In a last great effort, the Constitution fired a broadside and fractured the Guerriere's foremast. As it fell, it crushed the main mast and hurled a large number of sailors into the sea. The shattered British ship now was a shapeless mass, tossing unguided upon the waves. Her ensign fluttered from a slivered stump. Drawing away and firing continually and relentlessly with her stern guns, the Constitution maneuvered herself into raking position. But the colors of the enemy's ship were hauled down. Captain Hall was filled with mixed emotions as he saw the British flag go down. He was grateful for the victory, but the man he had beaten was his close friend. He couldn't bear the thought of facing him. He called Lieutenant Reed and sent him aboard the Guerriere. Captain Hall presents his compliments, sir, and wishes to know if you have really struck your flag, Reed said. Captain Dacres responded dryly with a glance at the shattered masts and bloody deck of his ship. Well, I don't know. Our mizzenmast is gone, our mainmast is gone, our men are gone, so I think you may say that we have struck our colors. Lieutenant Reed surveyed the wrecked ship and asked, "Would you like the assistance of a surgeon, sir, or a surgeon's mate, in caring for your wounded?" Dacres looked surprised and responded, "I should suppose you had on board your own ship business enough for all your medical officers." "Sir," answered Reed, "we have only 7 wounded, and they have been dressed long ago." The Americans set to work to remove the prisoners from the Guerriere, which was sinking. In the first boatload from the British ship was its commander, Captain Dacres, who was politely shown into Captain Hall's cabin. Unclasping his sword, the conquered British officer extended it silently and formally to his friend. But Captain Hall shoved it gently back. "No, no, Captain," he said. "I'll not take a sword from one who knows how to handle it so courageously. But, if you don't mind, I will now trouble you for that hat." Thank you so much for getting to the end of today's story. If you like listening to the stories on this channel, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.